Hi, I'm Sophie, and I'll be looking at parchment damage in a 15th century Netherlandish book of hours, and considering the importance of damage in medieval reading practices in order to encourage a focus on these damaged manuscripts during digitisation. Now, I'm no expert in digitisation, so I can't offer any solutions as to the best way to digitise damaged parchment, but I've seen my fair share of online digital manuscripts that attempt to ignore or hide damaged parchment, either by cropping it out of the image altogether or by taking photos of holes in situ where the folio parchment from the next folio is visible through the hole, making the hole basically invisible, which I think is not the best way to go. And so as we're all adjusting to more online work and research, focusing on manuscripts entirely online, sometimes without ever having seen the original manuscript, I think it's really important to consider what is lost when we look at manuscripts online. And for myself, I think the most important aspect that is lost is the tactile interaction of being skin to skin with a manuscript. And so, as to use Bill Brown's thing theory, we begin to confront the thingness of objects when they stop working for us, when the drill breaks, when the car stalls, when the window gets filthy, or in this instance, when the manuscript has holes in it. So parchment damage can actually draw our attention to the presence of parchment, and to allow us as researchers to consider parchment not as a vehicle for the text, but as an object in itself that has a lot of information. So we can learn a lot about parchment from parchment damage. For example, Catherine Rudy's Dirty Books, quantifying patterns of use in medieval manuscripts using a densitometer, can show us how looking at the dirt on a page can actually identify a medieval reader's favourite page in their book. And Eric Quackle's Decoding the Material book, Cultural Residue in Medieval Manuscripts, highlights how the items used to locate and clarify words can often provide just as much information as the words on the page themselves. But these alterations occur after the manuscript has been read, and post-production. However, the damage that occurs prior to the first reading of a manuscript can also provide us with a lot of information. How scribes predicted the reception of parchment damage can be really telling about medieval reading practices. And Heather Blatt explores this in her recent publication, Participatory Reading in Late Medieval England, and she explores this preemptive interaction, stating that writers recommend or use their texts to model a variety of practices that seek to elicit, shape, and frame the choices readers might make as they apprehend texts. Now, Heather Blatt situates the reader as the central role, whilst Blatt's focus remains on the writer as encouraging participatory reading. I would like to extend this to argue that the scribes and other people that were part of the manuscript production also encouraged this kind of participatory reading. And scribes and rubricators were often very aware that the material they were working with was in fact skin, and they often used this they took advantage of this, often to humorous effect, such as this 12th century doodle in a work of St Bernard of Clairvaux. And by using the framework of image analysis established by the likes of Mary Carruthers and Michael Camille, I hope to show that scribes encouraged participatory reading, and that the effect of this was felt none more poignantly than in religious texts. So, onto the case study. The folio that I should be exploring is from an Hours of Passion in the Dutch Book of Hours, written for the Bishopric of Munster in the 15th century. The manuscript measures 128 millimetres by 88 millimetres and is 285 leaves long. It contains full-page miniatures, illuminations and border decorations. And only 7 of these folios have been digitised online for open access, and you can see 6 of those folios here, and as you can see, they're very ornately decorated folios that show no signs of significant damage, but they are not the focus of my current study. I shall be looking at this folio 195V, which looks a little less conventionally beautiful than the previous manuscript folios that we were looking at. Whilst not openly accessible online, this page has been digitised by the Koninklijke Bibliotheek and was kindly supplied to me by Professor Catherine Rudy. So here's my conundrum. I am attempting to comment on the lack of focus of digitisation of damaged manuscripts whilst using a digital version of a damaged manuscript to do so. But as I mentioned earlier, I'm not attempting to critique or disparage the important work that's going on currently in digitisation projects, just to highlight the disparity between what is readily available and what isn't, and how we are interacting with these digital manuscripts. So this folio, I believe, provides a perfect example of why damaged parchment is just as informative as, and often more so, than the more elegantly ornate, decorated manuscripts. So as you can see, this folio has a tear in the lower left corner that covers around a quarter of the width of the page. And as you can see here, it's been highlighted by the rubricator in red ink. So tears like this are not uncommon in medieval manuscripts, and they do generally occur later on in the manuscript as the scriptorium becomes less and less selective with its parchment. But this particular folio is 195 out of 285, and there are plenty of unblemished folios after this. And so I would like to argue that the use of this particular damaged parchment at this particular point in the manuscript, which houses the Hours of Passion, is not due to a lack of parchment, but as a conscious selecting of animal skin to parallel the skin of Jesus and to encourage participatory reading. And so by the time this manuscript was in production, the analogy of Christ's skin as parchment was in widespread use, such as the 14th century Charters of Christ. And as Mary Carruthers states, the importance of visual images as memorial hooks and cues is a basic theme in all memory training advice and practice from the very earliest Western texts we possess. And so it would be amiss to suggest that the medieval reader didn't draw a correlation between the parchment damage transformed into a wound and the text of the Passion of Christ that accompanies it. And now this is particularly significant when we consider that the location of the wound is on the manuscript's proper right side, or on the left of it as we are looking at it, which is the generally accepted location of Christ's wound by the lance of Longinus. And so in this way, this becomes an almost replica of Christ's wound and allows the reader to not only witness the Passion of Christ through the text, but actually participate in it through insisting to feel the wound of the resurrected Christ in the position of St. Thomas. And so the tactile interaction of touching this parchment damage becomes a participatory reading and active remembering. It really deepens the religious aspect of the manuscript. And in this way, the damage is transformed into something truly significant and an indispensable part of the manuscript. And as researchers, I think it's really important that we don't lose sight of the significance of this tactile interaction. Just because we are not physically interacting with the pages of the manuscript, it doesn't mean that the medieval readers weren't, and that they weren't considering the importance of being skin to skin with the manuscript and, in some sense, with Christ. In addition to this, the rubricator has underlined the words blot and licum, or blood and body, in the same red ink that he used to outline the wound. And so the use of this red ink and its bloody connotations links the tear with blood and with body, both through the underlining of the words and visually through the colour of the ink. And so this encourages the reader of the manuscript to view the parchment damage as an open wound, and therefore recalling that the parchment that they are holding is the skin of an animal. And in this way, this particular parchment damage becomes the wound of an animal and the wound of Christ. And by simultaneously maintaining these two levels of meaning, the reader is encouraged to evoke the Lamb of God. As Sarah Kay states, given that Jesus is acclaimed theologically as God's Lamb and parchment is most frequently made of sheepskin, the association between material page and thematic content is particularly potent doctrinally as well as viscerally. And whilst the medieval rubricators or readers may not have known exactly what animal the parchment was made of, I think it's significant that the animal slaughtered to house the text that recounts the slaughtering of the Lamb of God could have been a lamb. And so it is this damage in the manuscript that is both the wound of Jesus and the wound of the animal, and also neither of these things because it's just a tear that occurred during the parchment production process, that creates a state of liminality in the parchment. And with our modern desire to categorise everything into neat binaries, I think it can be difficult to conceptualise something being multiple things at once. And so it's perhaps easiest to contemplate this by recalling Michael Camille's assertion that the margins, which is the location of this particular wound and parchment damage, seem to celebrate the flux of becoming rather than of being. Whilst this is generally applied to the extravagant marginalia that is often found in the margins of manuscripts, and I couldn't help but put a couple of my favourite marginalia on the screen here, I think this assertion applies quite aptly to the wound that we're looking at. So, parchment accounts, specifically this parchment, accounts both for the death of a once living animal and also its immortalisation in book form. And this parchment is both Jesus and animal, and also death and immortality. Death in the form of Jesus' crucifixion and the slaughtering of the animal for parchment, and immortalisation in heaven and in manuscript form of both the animal and of Jesus are present in this single parchment wound. But the living dying Jesus is not opposed to the living dying animal. Instead, all four liminal states of the living dying Jesus and the living dying animal are performed within this single parchment wound. And not only that, they depend upon each other for their most significant meaning. The animal skin is elevated by association with Jesus, Jesus' skin, yet Jesus' skin is given deeper meaning by being depicted upon what is most likely the skin of a lamb. And so each of these liminal states vie for the reader's attention, whilst gaining their greatest significance by relying upon the others. And on top of this, another type of liminality is present in this manuscript. This particular wound acts as an enactment of both weakness and of strength. It demonstrates the fragility of parchment, especially in the production phase, but its presence also highlights the strength of the remaining parchment in the reader's hand. The liminal presence and absence of parchment encourages the reader to recall the endurance of the parchment-making production. As Sarah Kay states, if inflicted upon a living human being rather than on a dead animal, the processes of parchment damage would be forms of torture. So the parchment is once again associated with Christ through its amalgamation of strength and of weakness during torture. Christ's weakness is highlighted through his wounds, his bodily weakness, yet the very crucifixion highlights his greatest strength. And so in this way, the wound acts as a memorial hook to remind the reader of Christ's crucifixion and his suffering for the reader's benefit, in turn highlighting the strength of Christ's love. And whilst these allusions are clearly present within the text, as Mary Carruthers states, a work is not truly read until one has made it part of oneself. Merely running one's eyes over the written page is not reading at all. Instead, to truly receive the value of the text, the reader must draw forth memories and create a network of interconnected layers of meaning. And this individual parchment damage, transformed into a wound by the rubricator, highlights this very act. And so, as I have shown through this rubricated wound, parchment damage, which initially appears unreadable to a modern scholar, was not viewed as such by a medieval reader. The parchment damage actually plays an important role in the religious value of the manuscript, and as researchers, we must not overlook the significance of this, specifically when we are looking at digital manuscripts and we are removed from the tactile interaction with damaged parchment. And whilst the digitisation of manuscripts has encouraged and nurtured much fruitful scholarship over the past few years, I urge that widespread attention be given to damaged parchment, both during digitisation projects, but also in medieval studies more broadly, as a way of looking at medieval reading practices. And so on this slide, I've provided a brief bibliography of materials that interact with this parchment damage in some way. You're very welcome to screenshot or take a photo of this page. And it's by no means exhaustive, but if you would like a more extensive reading list, feel free to email me or contact me on Twitter, either for that or for anything that's come up in this topic, and my details for that are on the screen now. And thank you very much for listening.